Well, good morning or afternoon, evening, everybody. I hope you've had a fantastic day and a week so far. Um, I know the weather has been a little bit crazy the last couple of weeks with frequent rain, and then next week it looks like we're going to have some really hot temperatures. So that'll play into an interesting bit of discussion when it comes to what we need to be doing with our bees. So just a couple of quick housekeeping things before we get started. If you have any questions, put them in the Q&A box. And Dodie Stillman is monitoring that for us. The Elams are taking a quick break this month, and Dodie is managing those questions. So if you have questions, put them in the Q&A box, and Dodie will take care of those for you guys. We've got a lot of ground to cover tonight. I'm super excited because we have Lynne Jones speaking the last half of our presentation tonight, covering a lot of really awesome topics from queen excluders, how they apply to supering, how they apply in other areas. It'll be fantastic to hear what she has to say, and it's super timely as we start thinking about adding supers, etc. So let's get going here. Couple quick side notes. We're winding down bee sales for the year. We'll be selling bees through the month of May, and we have plenty of nucs and single story hives left. You can order now and pretty much pick up the same week as orders get caught up. Everybody wants bees in April, and then demand starts to kind of drop off a bit as you get into May. And so you're able to kind of buy and pick up almost the same week. Another quick side note here. I'm really excited about this. I probably shouldn't be sharing about this because this stuff is selling so quickly that we're having a hard time keeping it in stock. But we launched a new line of products. It's a cedar, all cedar woodenware. So it's deep boxes, medium boxes, lids, bottom boards, etc., all made out of cedar. And this stuff smells incredible. I don't know why I'm so excited about it, but I am. I think it's just absolutely beautiful. I want one in my yard. It's just that beautiful red cedar. We get it out of Kentucky, and it's just a really cool product. And I know that we pretty much right away sold out of a lot of it, and I think we have the boxes are still in stock, and then we're getting a bunch more in hopefully soon. But just a beautiful product. I'm excited about it. And it's great for the bees too. The bees, the smell of the cedar doesn't bother the bees at all. And it's great at resisting rot and exterior pests and pests from burrowing into the wood. So very, very long lasting. Quick side note, you guys are familiar with all this, but if you're in one of our stores, grab one of these free monthly tip booklets on the far right. This it's really a condensed version of what we do here on these webinars. It's here's what you need to be doing each month in beekeeping. And then on the far left, of course, is our getting started guide if you're brand new to beekeeping. And that kind of walks you through everything you need to be doing in your brand new beehives. Quick update on this. Everybody keeps asking, so I want to just give you guys a bit of an update. A lot of folks are asking about our new store right outside of Austin. It is under construction, so it took forever to actually get to that point. There's a lot of permitting that has to go on, but it is under construction. We're planning on opening, still on schedule to open this fall. So late summer, early fall if we're lucky, mid to late fall if we're unlucky. Construction is not the same as it was pre-pandemic, and everything is really slow these days, but it is up and running, and we hope to be open in the next handful of months. So stay tuned on that. We're really excited. We'll have a grand opening and all that fun stuff, but we'll keep you posted on that branch just outside of Austin. With that, let's head out to the bee yard. One of the most exciting parts for all of us, I think, is to get to see what's going on out in the bee yard. And so I'm going to switch over to that video where we're going to take a look at what is going on in the bees for the month of May. Hey friends, so I came out here to film this bee yard video like usual, and you may not be able to see behind me, but it's going to start raining in about 10 minutes, and it's going to be raining on and off the rest of the day today. So I wanted to give you guys a quick update on kind of what I'm seeing out in the bee yard. The honey flow has started in most areas of Texas. Some areas it's just now getting started. In North Texas where I live, it's just getting started. you know, we're just now seeing the Scabiosa starting to bloom, and the Indium Blanket are starting to bloom. So that's kind of our major triggers. You know, Southeast Texas, the Tallow is just starting. Not well, Tallow really isn't starting yet. It's going to start within the next week to 10 days in most areas. So the honey flows across the state are really starting to kick in. The bees look great. We've had pretty good weather, frequent rains. Next week looks really warm and perfect for honey production. So the big things to keep in mind, of course, is if you've got a brand new hive, you need to keep feeding them until they draw out both deep boxes with honeycomb. And once the first box is 80% full, add another box. Once the second brood box is 80% full, add your honey super. And it may take, you know, 1 to 5 gallons of syrup, you know, to get them to go that far. And then if you have established hives, really the name of the game at this point is keeping those honey supers on anytime the top box is 80% full. So what I'm doing in this bee yard before it rains, if I can, is I'm checking to make sure these splits are queen right. And make sure that they're ready for another box. And I'm expecting most of these, you know, we're going to go through and add boxes to them today if the rain doesn't get in the way too much. So this time of year, we're just making sure our hives are healthy, they've got queens, and anytime a box is 80% full, we're adding another box. So, so yeah, with that, I'm going to cut over into some other bee yard videos that we're taking on a much prettier day. To talk about when it's time to add supers and show you examples of that in real hives. Okay, hang tight folks. Let me get this next screen shared here for the rest of our bee yard video. Here we go. One of the big things we're going to focus on out in the bee yard today is supering, because it's that time of year. It's time to start checking and seeing if hives are ready for supers, getting supers onto hives, and then checking to see if we need to add additional supers. And so that's a big thing that we're going to look at today. I always have to make note, I'm just wearing my nitrile gloves today because I'm going to try to find and mark a queen in just a minute. But bees do sting through these occasionally, but it's rare. The other thing I recently discovered that I'm probably the last one to realize this, but one of the things I love about these nitrile gloves, if you're just doing something quick and easy out in the bee yard, they're great to throw on and keep your hands somewhat protected from stings. But I've also started taking notes on them. So I'll actually get a Sharpie and I'll write notes about, oh, hey, this hive needed this hive needed this, or numbers, etc. So it's kind of a cool notepad. Okay, so this hive, let's take a look at it and see if it's ready for a super. Now, it was a new single-story hive, and we added a second box to it about a week or two ago. We added a second brood box, and we've been feeding it to get them to grow into that second brood box. So the first brood box was about 80% full of drawn comb, and then we added our second brood box. Now, we were fortunate, we had some previously drawn comb and then some foundation. My goal is when this second brood box I've just added 2 weeks ago, when it's 80% full of drawn honeycomb, then I'm ready to add my first super. So let's take a look and see what they're doing. So I'm looking at the number 3 frame here, and you can see they're just starting to draw out a little bit of wax. Not much, but just a little. You can see a little bit of white on that black foundation that they're just starting to draw out. So let's go another frame in. So this one, they're doing a little better. They're drawing a little bit more wax. On this other side, you can see that they've drawn out quite a bit more wax. So they're certainly working, but they're not, they're not quite ready for a honey super yet. Usually once they start drawing out the foundation on the 7th and 8th frame, that's when I'm ready to add another box. So these bees are doing well. They're drawing out comb. You can see here, I mean, again, it's pretty beautiful. You know, they're drawing out that beautiful white beeswax. queen even has eggs all in here. I don't know if you can see it in the video or not. I'll get a little closer and perhaps you can. But you can actually, if the sunlight hits just right, then you can see eggs down in the bottom of those cells. So she's doing great. She's moving up like she's supposed to into the second brood box. For a hive like this, they've got maybe the middle 5 frames drawn out with honeycomb. I'm going to keep feeding them, and I'm going to say in about another week to 10 days, they're probably going to be ready for a honey super. But generally speaking, once they are drawing out the 7th and 8th frame in that second box, that's when you're ready to add a honey super. And so when we're ready to add a honey super, let's pretend this hive has that 7th and 8th frame already being drawn out. It's really simple. We're just going to get our box of, now this is a super of foundation, so the comb isn't drawn yet, and we're just going to place it directly on top of that second brood box. Now, like I said, this is just foundation, so it's not drawn honeycomb. And so we're going to put it on, and I'm going to keep feeding, and I'm going to come back about a week later, and once they've got about a fist-sized piece of honeycomb drawn out on these center frames, which usually takes about a week if you're still feeding, then I'm going to come back in a week, and I'm going to put my queen excluder between that top brood box and my honey super. Now this is a really critical step, because if you put that queen excluder on before they start drawing out foundation up in this box, the bees are not going to travel through that queen excluder to start drawing out foundation. They just refuse to do it. So they've got to get started drawing out foundation, and then you can add your queen excluder about a week later. And then it's simple from there. Once this box is 80% drawn out with honeycomb, you're ready to add your second honey super. This hive is a good example of a hive that needs food. A lot of people have questions about feeding in the spring. How much do I feed? For how long? Why do I feed at all? Really common issue that I see with brand new beekeepers is them not feeding enough. And they may feel like, hey, my hive isn't growing as quickly as it seems like it should. What's going on? And you've got to keep in mind that bees, especially when they're in a growth phase, they need a lot of food in order to draw out honeycomb and to grow as quickly as possible. So this hive right here was actually a package that we installed, actually on video, probably a month ago. Let's see, what is today? Today is May 6th. So yeah, it was about a month ago that we installed this package. And we fed, for point of reference, we fed this package 2 gallons of syrup in the past month, which isn't nearly enough. You can see they've got bees on about the middle 4 frames, and these outside frames, they really haven't started drawing out foundation at all. And this would apply to a newly installed nook or even a single story hive. So here you can see that they have drawn out, this is the 4th frame on one side. They've drawn it out. They've got a little bit of pollen in there, but not a lot of nectar or stored syrup. This time of year, I want to see multiple frames of stored syrup or honey in my hive. I like in the brood boxes, I like to see, this time of year, probably 3 to 4 frames of stored honey or syrup in each brood box. That's kind of my goal, and the rest should be brood. So here, one of the big things I watch for is, do I have a band of honey around my brood? So here, I've got good cap brood, and I've got a little bit of honey and nectar around the edges, but not much. If you're looking at your frames in your hive and you've got brood in the middle and there is virtually no stored honey around the edge on most of the frames, I get pretty concerned. I mean, that's concerning to me when I'm not seeing, a band of honey around the edges of those frames, and then some excess frames of honey as well. Now, once the honey flow really kicks into full gear, you shouldn't have to feed your bees. They're going to grow fine on natural nectar. but while they're in that early growth phase, they often need help, and they need you to do some feeding to really help them to grow as quickly as they need to grow. Now, what's kind of cool about this hive is we haven't fed it in a couple of weeks, and I came and checked it last week and it was on the verge of starvation. There was virtually no stored nectar. But this week, they've actually got pretty good bands of nectar now around the brood. And they've got a couple extra frames of honey on the outside. So you can kind of see that nectar all around the edges here. Not a lot, but there's a little bit. And so the honey flow is really starting. You know, they're really starting to bring in some honey. But it would still boost them a lot and help them if we did some feeding. I'm going to mark this queen. I found the queen here, and I'm gonna, just because, hey, we're out here, I'm gonna show you guys how to mark a queen really quickly. So first you need your marking pin. This year happens to be white, and you've got to find your queen. So finding your queen is the real battle. And so I'm gonna try to get you a closer shot of her here, but she's right here. And so here's our queen. And so one of the important things when you're marking a queen is you want to pick her up by her thorax. So you don't want to hold her by her abdomen. Her abdomen is too soft. Now, the best advice I can give you is practice with drones. So pick up and mark 100 drones and then you're ready to mark a queen. Because if you kind of squish a drone, no big deal. Now, you do need to either be wearing nitrile gloves or bare gloves. You don't want to be wearing, you know, bare hands. You don't want to be wearing leather gloves because they're too awkward, and you'll squish that queen as you try to pick her up. So I recommend nitrile gloves if you're nude, because it'll make you a little more comfortable about not getting stung. So put on your gloves, practice on a bunch of drones. You're going to pick them up by the thorax with these two fingers. Pick them up by the thorax. Put a dot on that drone. So for marking the queen, I'm going to pick her up right off the comb by the thorax. Now, sometimes I have to kind of hold her a little bit and adjust a bit to get her held properly, and that's fine. She's pretty tough. Just be very gentle. But you can see I'm holding her by her thorax, and so, you know, her thorax is where I'm putting the pressure to hold her very, very gently, which means her thorax is exposed, so I can put a mark on it. So I've got her thorax exposed, I've got my marking pin, and now I'm just gonna put a little dot, and there goes my camera. That's an opportune time. Sorry about that, guys. So I'm holding my queen right here by her thorax, and then I'm putting a little dot on her, right? Gently, you know, just putting a little mark. And then I like to hold her for just a couple of minutes. I'm sorry, not a couple minutes. Maybe 10 seconds. Let that mark dry just a little bit, because otherwise the bees will bite it off, and then release her back onto the frame. And, you know, some marks will stay for a long time and others won't. You know, some bees, after a few months, they'll kind of chew that mark off the queen. Other bees, you know, they'll leave it on indefinitely. But there you go. So this hive, you know, like I said, we were talking about feeding, and we got sidetracked, which is easy to do when we're playing in the bee yard. But you can see they had about 2 frames of brood, and then they've got an outside frame. This outside frame is actually pretty much all nectar, which is awesome. So they've got, you know, a band of honey around 2 frames of brood, and then they've got 2 partial frames of honey or stored nectar. In general, I'd like to see a package further advanced than this one, or a nook. So if we had fed probably 4 gallons over the last month, I think you'd see this hive almost twice this size, because they can only grow if they have sufficient food. And so whether you newly installed a nook or a package or made a split, you know, make sure you're feeding them up to 1 gallon per week if they'll drink it, so that they can draw out new comb, raise baby bees, and grow as quickly as we want them to, so we can make a honey crop. If you don't care about making a honey crop, you don't have to be quite as aggressive on feeding. But if you want to make a honey crop, and this is especially if this is your first year in beekeeping or you've made splits, you got to feed to really help them grow. And my goal is to have their 2 brood boxes full of brewed honey or stored syrup, so that when I put my honey super on, all that nectar that they bring in goes right into my honey supers, instead of having to fill up brood boxes with that precious nectar. So that's if you really want to optimize honey. You know, if honey isn't a huge goal of yours, then you can kind of just let them work through drawing out that foundation on more of a natural flow, but it'll certainly be slower. So this hive is kind of interesting because it was actually, it's 2 deep brood boxes, so it was a really good strong hive, and then it swarmed. And so obviously when the hive swarms, it really reduces the strength of the hive. And so I wanted to just look at it quickly with you guys and give you some observations. Now, one thing right off the bat, it's actually, it swarmed about 3 weeks ago. And so if you look, it's actually quite full of bees. They've replenished themselves quickly. My favorite thing to do as I'm looking at hives when I'm trying to judge the population of the hive is to look at the top box and the bee population in it before I smoke the hive. And I get you can get a really good feel for how many bees there are in a hive as you look kind of down between the frames before you smoke it. And I want to try to show you guys here. If you look down between these frames, you can see they're actually full of bees. I mean, down between each one of these frames, you can see it's just full of bees. We've even got bees over here by this division board feeder. And so, you know, this is a hive that honestly, without even going any further, I'm gonna say is about ready for a super, even, you know, assuming they've got a queen with, you know, that's laying eggs, that's, you know, assuming they raise the new queen after they swarmed, just judging on the bee population, it's about ready for another box. So let's confirm that they did raise them new queen for themselves, and if they did, then based on this bee population, this one's ready for a honey super. So I'm gonna pull up some of these frames and see what we've got going on. So I've got a lot of fresh nectar, which is fantastic to see. And I'm seeing some clues that they either have a queen or may have one soon. One of the biggest things I look for, and I'll adjust this so you can see it, but you can see there's fresh nectar all around the edge of this frame. Hopefully you can kind of see it shimmering in there. But in the center of this frame, they don't have anything stored. They're wide open patches of cells, that whole center area. Now there's no eggs in there, but they've got it wide open as if they're getting ready for a queen to lay. And you'll often see that in a hive when they're raising a new queen. You know, a week or so before that queen starts to lay, they'll start clearing patches in the middle of the frames in the brood nest for her to begin laying. So that's kind of a clue. I like to see that. It's not always a guarantee that they've got a queen, but it's a clue that, hey, I think they're probably gonna have a queen and she's probably gonna be laying soon. Now on the bottom of this frame, check those queen cells out. Now they're hatched, so if you kind of look at these queen cells, you can see there's a huge one. They're all empty. See, they're the hole where the queen has emerged. So I know that they raised the queen, and I know that she is out. So again, the odds are looking pretty good that we're gonna have a laying queen in this hive that swarmed. So let's proceed a little bit further. And yes, I'm seeing eggs. So yeah, so they were preparing for that new queen. You can kind of see here, look at all those empty swarm cells on the bottom of that frame. It's kind of the classic swarm cells on the bottom of a frame, but they're all empty. I mean, so they've all hatched, and the bees just haven't torn them down yet. But it looks like they did successfully raise a new queen, because these center frames, they don't have a lot of eggs, but you can see that she is indeed starting to lay. So I think probably in the past couple of days, really, this new queen has just begun to lay. Now it's hard to see those eggs. I mean, you gotta tilt this frame so the sunlight shines right down into those cells. And I tell folks all the time, you know, if you have a hard time finding eggs, take a bunch of pictures with your smartphone or your video. Get this frame angled so the sunlight shining right down into the cells. Take those pictures, usually about 6 inches or so from the frame. Take some videos, and then you can go inside and zoom up on those pictures or video and see those eggs if you have trouble, you know, spotting eggs. So anyway, so this hive, it's really looking good. I mean, they've rebounded really well after swarming. They've got the second box pretty much full of bees. They've got a queen who's now laying eggs. So I'm going to, off the video, I'm going to add a super to this hive. I'll put a super, I'm going to feed them for another week or so, let them get started in that super, and they'll probably never miss a beat, having swarmed and recover just fine. So the last video I showed, I was going to make that the last because I know we're running a little bit long in the videos here, but I took a quick peek into this hive, and it was just a little too exciting not to show you guys. So this was a single story hive that was 80% full of bees and drawn comb. And so we added a second brood box. We happened to add a medium for a second brood box on this hive about a week ago. Now our second medium was already drawn comb, and I just wanted to show you guys in the past week what they've done. And now this is in North Texas, in the North Texas area, but I'm seeing similar occurrences even in Southeast Texas elsewhere. They've already filled up probably the middle 5 frames with fresh nectar, and even capping off a little bit of it already. So the honey flow is definitely on. I mean, you can see the nectar down in the bottom of those frames, and that's, you know, this hive wasn't fed, and so you can see that they're already starting to bring in nectar. They're filling up the center of these frames. So I mean, the honey flow is definitely on. I mean, you know, you can look in the hives and you can see they're adding white comb to the top bars. They're bringing in nectar. Yeah, so the honey flow has begun for sure. You know, these a week, 10 days ago, these hives were needing to be fed because they were, you know, almost starving. But you know, now 7-10 days later, after some good rains, you know, and those flowers are really starting to bloom, these hives are bringing in the honey. So make sure you've got your supers ready, and don't let them get more than 80% full, and keep adding the supers. Okay, so there you go, guys. I keep meaning to mention this after our video section of the webinars. If there are any really talented beekeeping videographers out there that would like to make a couple bucks and get a free education in beekeeping out in the bee yard with me once a month, then let me know, because I'd love to connect with you. So May tips. So you guys kind of got a bit of an overview with what's going on out in the bees through that video, and you know, that's all the things that I mentioned in the video are exactly what I was seeing. You know, some of those videos were a bit old, but hyper applicable for this year. It's hard to believe it's already May. I don't know how that happened. If you're a commercial beekeeper or sideline beekeeper, March and April just vaporize. I mean, they just, you know, I've been in the bees so much over the past 2 months that I barely know what day it is. And May is when we finally start emerging out of that chaos and say, oh, you know, wow, the weather's beautiful. It's really nice that it's spring, because March and April just completely disappeared. So one quick thing I wanted to mention, just an observation. Every year is a little bit different, and every year kind of brings its own challenges in the beekeeping world. A couple things I've heard a lot of folks mention this year, and we've experienced them ourselves, is there were about 2 to 3 weeks in April that were just crazy windy all over the South and all over Texas. And that really affected a lot of the queen mating quality in Texas. I have never seen more beautiful, perfect drone laying queens than I have this year. Usually when we're doing splits or making nooks, et cetera, we usually see maybe 1 to 2% of those that don't accept the queen and become drone layers. So 1 to 2% is about what we expect to see. Now, we usually see about 10% total that don't accept the queen, and we have to fix them somehow. But usually only 1 to 2% of those actually become drone laying hives or drone laying queens. This year, we've been seeing almost 10% drone laying queens or drone laying hives, which is way high. Now, they're gorgeous. It's like the most beautiful drone laying pattern you've ever seen, but a lot more than we've ever seen in the past. And I think that's because we just really had a couple weeks there where it was so windy so consistently, those queens weren't able to get out and mate. So later tonight, we'll here in a few minutes, we're going to talk a little bit about what to do about drone laying hives and what we do and what I recommend. And then another big issue this year is there is a plant in a lot of East Texas called jasmine, yellow jasmine. And jasmine is kind of an invasive plant. It's all over East Texas, Southeast Texas. And the nectar is actually poisonous to bees. And so it doesn't bloom prolifically every year. It did this year. It was a huge jasmine bloom this year, and that killed a lot of queens and bees as folks were trying to raise them in East Texas. So kind of a couple of interesting challenges there that we don't see every year that we did see this year. So high nectar blooms are blooming or about to start blooming. So some things that I am seeing just starting to bloom, the scabiosa or the pincushion over here on the far left, that just started popping this week, which is a great nectar producer for bees. The tallow, the Chinese tallow tree here in the middle, this is some of the tassels I'm seeing right now. I'm not seeing a lot of blooms yet on the Chinese tallow, but the tassels are kind of standing up and starting to tip over, like you see in this picture, which usually means we've got about a week to 10 days. Now, obviously, the Chinese tallow grows the most along the Gulf Coast, within about 100 miles of the Gulf Coast. There is some in East Texas, Central Texas, et cetera, just not as much as there is along the Gulf Coast, but it's a major nectar producer. And, the closer you go to the coast, the sooner it's going to bloom. Right up against the coast, there's some that'll start blooming probably next week for sure. And then the further away from the coast you get, the later it gets. But it's about ready. Seeing some clovers blooming. Ball clovers have already bloomed. Some of the yellow and white clovers are just about to start. And then, of course, my favorite over on the far right is the Indium Blanket or Gaillardia. That has been blooming for a while in Southeast Texas, blooming in Central Texas, just starting to bloom in North Texas. And so if you're in South Texas, like Austin area, San Antonio area, there have been, the bee brush has already come and gone at this point, and a lot of the wildflowers are in full bloom at this point as well. So kind of across Texas, and the same applies across a lot of the South. We're kind of transitioning from those early pollen producing flowers where our bees really build up in strength. We're transitioning to the high nectar producing flowers where our bees are actually going to be able to make a surplus of honey. And if you're not from the South, and if you're wondering, well, what about in New York or New Jersey, the best thing to do, even if you're in Texas, the best thing to do is get to know experienced local beekeepers, and they're going to be able to tell you often within the week when your major nectar producing flow starts, because it's different. I mean, it can be different in different areas of North Texas and different areas of South Texas. It can be different, a little different in Louisiana, a little different in Alabama. Usually they all start within a couple of weeks if you're in the same planting zone. But when you start jumping into other planting zones, it can vary a lot. So your local beekeepers can really help you out a lot with that. So in the South, the major nectar flow usually begins in early May and typically winds up completely ending by the 4th of July. If you're in the southern half of the US, in general, there are little pockets of exceptions, but in general, by the 4th of July, it's all pretty much burned up and gone. If you're in the northern half of the United States, it could be just starting. As commercial beekeeper, I pick up my bees in late June, mid to late June, and when all the flowers finish blooming in the South, and I move them all up to North Dakota, where the flow is just starting, and I can make 2 crops off of the same honeybees. So I kind of mentioned this before in the video, but what I'm seeing is, we've had some pretty widespread rains in most of Texas and the South. And so it's really helped reduce some of those drought conditions. Some areas are still a little dry, but in general, we're not seeing a huge drought. The honey flow is certainly ramping up in all regions. And some places it's just barely a trickle. Some places it's 100% full steam ahead. Early indicators, if I'm looking at my glass or my crystal ball, looks like it could be a pretty good year for honey production. It's been a couple years since, I've thought that, and I've certainly been wrong, but, I'm encouraged by some of these early rains we've gotten, and the next couple weeks look kind of hot and dry, which is great. We get that good soaking rain, and then we get some hot, dry weather. That's a perfect recipe for nectar production in most plants. So I'm optimistic at this point. I'm going to jump over real quick to Lauren Ward, because a super common question a lot of people have is, we've kind of touched on it, but how do you tell when a honey flow is starting? And so Lauren has some really good tips for us on how to tell if a honey flow is starting in your area, and by looking at the bees, which is the best way to tell.
How you tell the honey flow has begun. In the spring, it's usually pretty dramatic. But for me, part of beekeeping is learning everything bee adjacent. And so if you're in Texas, you may know one of the first major flows is Yaupon. So if you're Central or East Texas, Yaupon holly is going to be one of your first major flows. And so I find myself learning more and more plants, keeping an eye on things. And so usually I know when something is close to blooming. Like this year I was watching the elm trees, as I do most years, and they bloom about the 3rd week of January here. But if looking in your hives and outside your hives, even the way to know you're on a honey flow, you're going to have a whole lot of activity. It's going to sound like an airport because they're coming in loaded with nectar. So they're heavy bees coming into land. They may have some congestion at the entrance because there's so many foragers going out if you've got a real populous hive. When you look in that hive, you're going to probably have they're going to be doing what's called whitening comb. And what that is they're making wax. They're kind of stimulated to make wax. And so around the edges of things, there's going to be bright white new wax. That's a really good sign. And then honestly, as you're lifting through it, if they've been putting it up a little while, you'll know it's heavy. But right at the first, you may just have a whole lot of frames that have that, shine of nectar in the cells. As a flow goes on, so like a really heavy, like a tallow flow, they may even start cramming that nectar into cells you don't want them to, kind of in the brood nest. So that's another sign. So yeah, spring usually comes on, hard, heavy. And then that kind of slows down. So we've got several plants that are really heavy producers, and then little plants in the middle that are decent producers. And then summer kind of dries off, and then we get to fall, and most of the time we get decent honey in the fall. It depends. Depends on where you are. If you're in a good goldenrod area, that's great. Actually, the hill country does fairly well in the fall, to me, surprisingly well. In the fall, they may not be stimulated quite to that same extent as they are in the spring. So you might not see them whitening a lot of comb. You might not see that, but you are probably going to notice just weight-wise. So the fall is when I'm going, especially later in the fall, to go check weight. And by weight, I mean honey and nectar, because that's the heavy stuff. And so, you take that super off, and all of a sudden it weighs 20 pounds. And that's the fall flow. And it'll creep up on you. They can sometimes put up quite a bit of honey, and if not, you're feeding. So that's when I'm noticing, is when I'm checking for weight anyway, and I'm saying either the plants will do it or I will do it in the fall, but it's a little more gradual than the spring.
Perfect. So there you go. Great answer on, how to tell, when a honey flow is really getting started. So you may not have known when you started getting into beekeeping, but you have to become a botanist as well as a beekeeper. I find myself staring at the row ditches and looking at plants more than I ever imagined that I ever would have done before I started beekeeping. Let me grab a quick poll from you guys, if you don't mind. This is just really interesting, and ignore the title of splits. I forgot to rename the title. But the question is, are you seeing a surplus honey flow in your area, yes or no? And so this would be, are you seeing, the bees bringing in a tremendous amount of nectar, enough that they can start filling up supers? Or are you just kind of seeing them bring in a trickle enough to maybe make a living, but they're not really storing it up in supers yet? So it looks like you guys are always so fast at answering, which is really cool. You're awake, so that's good to see. It looks like about 32% say yes, you're seeing a major nectar flow in your area. About 68-69% of you are not seeing a major nectar flow. So about a third of you are seeing that major nectar flow. About 2/3 of you are not seeing it yet. So that's about what I would expect this time of year. So if you're not seeing that major nectar flow, if the bees aren't filling up your honey supers, you're not alone. You're 2/3 of folks are with you. But about a third of you lucky folks are already seeing that. What I expect to see inside May hives, your hives should be exploding in strength. I usually expect my bees to be at peak strength sometime in the month of May. So unless, of course, it's a brand new split or a brand new nook or something, if it's a hive you recently purchased, I wouldn't expect that. But if it's an established hive, I expect my bees to be at peak population in May. That's when I need them to do the most work and bring in a tremendous amount of honey. So I expect to see several frames of brood in all different stages. My hives that are ready to produce honey, I'm expecting them to have, 8 to 12 frames of brood in every single hive if I'm expecting to make a honey crop on them. So they should be bursting at the seams this time of year. If you have newer hives, you may need to be feeding those new hives up to 1 gallon of syrup a week to really get them to draw out that new comb and to do all the work they need to do to grow. You don't need to worry about feeding new pollen substitute. The bees are bringing in plenty of natural pollen. If you did put on pollen patties or pollen substitute, it's not going to hurt anything. It's just not necessary this time of year. Remember, if you've got a new hive, your goal is to continue to feed until they get that bottom box about 80% drawn out. So about 8 of the 10 frames, or if you've just got 8 frames in a feeder like this hive, once they start drawing out those 2 outside frames with honeycomb, that's when it's time to add your second brood box. You'll keep feeding until that second brood box is about 80% full. Then you can add your first super. You can add an entrance reducer on the largest opening if you have a hive that's less than 1 deep box full of bees. Any hives that are a deep box full of bees or more shouldn't have should not have an entrance reducer on them at this point. Something that's super common that a lot of folks see is bearding. They'd say, hey, I went out and looked at my bees and there were bees hanging all over the front of the hive. What's going on with that? That becomes increasingly common as the weather gets warmer and warmer, especially if you're in a humid area. And typically it's not something to worry about. So if you're in a Southeast Texas where it's really hot, really humid, super common, especially in the evening, to see the bees bearding out as all the foragers return for the night. And instead of going inside and making it all hot and stuffy inside, the foragers will just hang out on the front of the hive. The big thing to watch for is making sure that there's enough space available for the bees in the hive. So if you've got a hive that's bearding out like crazy and all the boxes on the hive are completely full of bees, that's when they could be prepping to swarm. So that's where you would really want to make sure you're adding boxes proactively when that top box gets to 80% full, so you don't have a swarming issue. But if your top box is not 80% full yet, it's 50% full, and you're getting that bearding on the front, usually just means that it's too hot and stuffy inside, and the bees want to be outside instead of inside. A couple quick things on adding boxes. When should you stop adding supers? So really, it's when the honey flow is coming to an end, which in most parts of the South, that's mid to late June. So typically speaking, unless it's a really unusual year, I stop adding boxes late June and let them just finish completely filling out whatever boxes they do have. And then I do my honey harvest. If you are brand new to beekeeping and this is your first year, you've got a brand new hive, your goal this year is just to get them to fill up both of their brood boxes. If they happen to fill up both of their brood boxes with drawn comb and bees before mid-June, go ahead and add a honey super, and they may actually make a honey crop in their first year, but I wouldn't necessarily expect that. Another common question on supering is, can I add 2 supers at once? So you've got your 2 brood boxes on the bottom. Any boxes above those 2 brood boxes we call supers. And you can add more than 1 super at a time. You know, if you don't live near your hives, you know, if you live an hour away from your hives and it's a really good, strong hive, you could add 2 boxes and come back 3 weeks later and check them again. So adding a couple boxes at a time isn't necessarily a problem. And I would do that if I don't live near my hives for sure. Another thing you might hear about a lot with supering is called bottom supering, and bottom supering versus top supering. And bottom supering is basically when you've already got 1 super on the hive and it's pretty much full of, 80% full. And instead of putting another super on top of it, you would pick up that empty or that full super and then put the brand new super underneath it. So you'd have your 2 brood boxes, a brand new super, and then an almost full super on top. And so that's called bottom supering. And it works a little bit better than top supering because it allows the bees to access that empty super a little bit faster. So instead of coming in the entrance of the hive, crawling through all the boxes to get up to the very top empty one, they can just go right above the brood nest and start putting that honey and nectar into that brand new super that you just bottom supered with. It's not necessary, but a lot of folks like it. It might give you a little bit more honey. And if you have brand new foundation and you don't have drawn comb, they will draw it out faster if it's kind of sandwiched between the brood boxes and that full box. So bottom supering doesn't hurt anything, not critical, but especially with foundation, they do draw it out a little faster. Speaking of supers, this is something that a lot of people ask about. Checkerboarding frames. And what I mean by that is a lot of folks talk about, oh, I want to checkerboard my frames. I want to take a frame of foundation, so a frame of undrawn comb, and I want to put it between some drawn frames. So basically every other frame is foundation in the hive. For honey supers, that's perfectly fine to do. We do that all the time with honey supers. So instead of putting an entirely new box of foundation on top of a hive, we'll put every other frame foundation and every other frame drawn comb, and it works great for honey supers. Don't ever do it in a brood box. You don't ever want to break up the brood nest. In your brood boxes, brood should always stay together. Drawn comb should always stay together. Any frames of foundation, you can put them on the outside of the box if you need to add them for some reason, but you don't ever want to insert those frames of foundation checkerboard style into a brood box, because now you've separated all the brood. And if you get a chilly night like we had a couple nights ago, the bees may not be able to keep all that brood warm and you'll have a brood kill. So perfectly fine to do checkerboarding in honey supers. Don't ever do it in brood boxes. Couple of things I'm going to run through just this quick list. These are some really common issues that I've had a lot of people ask about this year. This has been a common one. I don't know if it's something to do with the wind we've had, but a lot of folks have said, hey, my beehive looked great. I went out there a week later and it was queenless. What happened? A lot of times I'm going to blame it on swarming. Swarms have been a little late this year, but they're in full swing now. Lots of hives are swarming, and that's a really common reason to suddenly have a queenless hive. If you didn't pay really close attention, they could have swarmed. The new queen could have hatched out. The bees could have chewed down those swarm cells, and she just hasn't started laying yet. And you may have never even seen those queen cells. So if you've got a hive that was really strong and is suddenly just queenless, give them about 2 weeks, and oftentimes you will see a new queen lay. Now, one little tip, a little trick that I do all the time that I find super helpful in diagnosing what's going on in a queenless hive. If I have a hive that's queenless, then I'm not sure why, and I'm not sure if they have another queen, a virgin queen, but I don't want to like waste putting a $40 queen in there, not knowing if they have a virgin queen or not. What I do all the time is I go to a stronger hive and I pull out one frame that has a bunch of eggs and larvae on it, and I put it in that queenless hive. And then I'll come back 3 or 4 days later. If that hive does not have a virgin queen, that frame that you put in full of eggs and larvae, they will have drawn out queen cells all over the place on it because they're trying to raise a new queen. If after 3 or 4 days, there are no queen cells anywhere on that frame of eggs and larvae I put into the hive, I know they probably have a virgin that's going to start laying soon. Otherwise, they would have started drawing out queen cells all over the place. So that's a quick, easy way to tell. If they did start drawing out queen cells all over the place, I could just leave that frame in there and let them raise a new queen. If I really want to make a honey crop, or if I'm really trying to maximize production on my hives, then I would go get a new queen and put her in and let them release her, in a couple days. Back off to the races. So another really common thing is, hey, bees aren't drawing out comb in my honey super. What's wrong? Why aren't bees drawing out comb? 2 really, really common reasons. Number one, they don't have enough natural nectar coming in, or you're not feeding them enough. Kind of like I showed you in that video, I really like to keep feeding my hive until they just start drawing out honeycomb in the honey super and then stop. If you didn't feed them up to that point, it could be that they still don't have enough food to finish fully drawing out their brood boxes, and they're using their resources to do that. So if they really aren't drawing out comb like I want them to, I usually give them more food and try to get them to jumpstart that process again. Another thing that I'm sure Lynne is going to talk about is, you don't want to put a queen excluder on and then put a box of foundation above the queen excluder, because bees don't like drawing out honeycomb through a queen excluder. So I won't get into that too much because I'm sure she'll probably touch on that. So another really common thing is, hey, my bees aren't growing. Why aren't my bees growing? And that's a really big question that can have a lot of potential answers. If you're brand new to beekeeping, a lot of times I tell folks, just be patient. It takes time for a hive to grow. You're not going to install a nook 1 week and next week they're just exploding and ready for another box. Sometimes it happens that way, but more often than not, it doesn't. You've got to look over a period of weeks to see, are they slowly growing? If a hive has plenty of food, a laying queen, brood looks good, then oftentimes you just have to be patient and let them grow. If they're not growing over a period of weeks, if you've checked them 2 weeks and 3 weeks and 4 weeks and they're not really growing, then there could be an issue. Make sure that they do have a queen, make sure she's laying, make sure the brood looks good. You might want to get a mentor out there to double check them. But, I wouldn't necessarily expect to see a ton of growth, from 1 week to the next, but you should see growth, steady growth, when you're looking at a 3 or 4 week period. And then finally, hey, my bees aren't eating syrup. Why aren't my bees drinking the syrup? Could be a couple of reasons. One, it could be because they don't need it. Could be you're in an area with an awesome natural nectar flow and the bees just aren't drinking it because they don't want to. It could be that you've made it too thin. If you ever get thinner than a 1-to-1, 1 part sugar to 1 part water syrup, the bees often won't drink the syrup. So make sure it's thick enough, and then make sure the bees have sufficient access to the feed. And you can always put a little bit of Pro Health, which we sell, lots of folks do. It's an essential oil mixture with lemongrass. And if you mix that with syrup, it often really encourages the bees to drink it a little bit faster. Real quick on Bromite treatments, I wouldn't treat for bromites in May because, hey, this is when we're producing a lot of honey. So if your mites are below 3 per 100 bees, I would just wait it out until you harvest in late June. And then you can do a mite treatment then. I would encourage you to do a mite test if you haven't done one yet this spring. If you have over 3 to 4 mites per 100 bees, then you could do a treatment that is natural, that won't introduce any potential chemical contaminants into the hive when they're producing honey. So if you need to do some sort of natural mechanical treatment during the honey flow, I would use these drone frames. We have a ton of these in stock this time of year, but it's just a green frame. You put it in the hive kind of towards the edge, let the bees draw it out. Then you can move it more to the middle. The queen will lay drones in this green drone frame. And Varroa mites are really attracted to drone brood. And so a lot of the Varroa mites in the hive will go to that drone brood. Once the bees cap over that drone brood, you take this frame out, shake the bees off, put it in your freezer, kills off the drones and all the Varroa mites, and then you can leave it frozen and use it again next year, or put it back in the hive and start that cycle over again. It does not completely control Varroa mites, but it can help if you're trying to get Varroa mites under control during a honey flow. The big caution with these things, you've got to watch the timing, because you don't want to leave this drone frame in so long that all those drones full of all those Varroa mites hatch out in the hive. So you've got to pull this out and freeze it before those drones start hatching out. Doing this with the drone frames in combination with screen bottom boards and dusting the hive with powdered sugar every week or so can keep Varroa mite levels under control if you have a problem until you harvest your honey in June. If you've got a brand new hive, you shouldn't have to worry about it. Most people that sell bees make sure Varroa mites are under control before they sell them to you. So if you're a brand new beekeeper, you just bought a hive or a nook, if you bought it from us, which you may have if you're on this call, you don't have to worry about Varroa mites until summer. But if you've got an established hive that you have above 3 or 4 mites per 100, employ some of these natural methods to keep them low until you harvest honey, and then you can do something else once you harvest honey. Okay, I'm going to touch on drone layers real quick because I did mention them. This picture on the right is a great example of one of those beautiful drone layers I was telling you about. This brood almost looks normal. There's so much of it, but it was actually a drone laying queen. So the first thing I try to establish when I have a hive that the brood is all super bumpy like this, it's all drone brood instead of worker bee brood. The first thing I try to establish is, do I have laying workers, or do I have a queen that never mated and is thus laying drones? Because there's a difference. If you have laying workers in a hive, that brood does not look like what you see in this picture. This is, in my opinion, almost always a queen that just didn't mate properly or didn't mate at all. And so she's laying unfertilized eggs, which turn into drones. That's why there's so much of that brood. And it's almost a decent brood pattern. So if I see, 2 or 3 or 4 frames completely full like this one of drone brood, I know somewhere running around in there, I've got a queen that's laying. She's just laying drones. If it's super sporadic, kind of really shotgun pattern, not solid in pattern like this, I usually assume it's laying workers. So that hive went queenless. They never raised a new queen. There's no queen to emit pheromone. And so after 3 or 4 weeks, the worker bees start laying unfertilized eggs. And that's when it's laying worker. So figure out which is which. If it's a laying queen, the process for fixing them is pretty simple. You go through the hive, you find that queen, you kill her, give them maybe a fresh frame or 2 of brood from a stronger hive, give them a new queen, you're good to go. If they're laying workers, you've got to get rid of those laying workers. So the protocol there is you take this whole box, you shake all the bees out 30 or 40 feet away from where they originally were, move that hive back to its original location, give them a couple frames of fresh brood, and give them a new queen. And it works most of the time. What I do commercially is when I find a drone laying hive, I shake all the bees out and stack up the equipment and move on. It's often not worth bothering trying to fix these things because it only works about 50% of the time. So if you really want to save it, if there's a whole bunch of bees in the hive, you can do one of those two things I just mentioned and try to save it. If it's a really weak hive, if they only have a couple frames of bees and they're a drone layer, shake the bees out, use that equipment somewhere else in your operation and move on. It's not really worth saving. So I don't really know any commercial beekeepers or even many sideline beekeepers that ever try to really save drone layers. It's usually not worth the expense. But if you want to, shaking them out, giving them a few frames of fresh brood, giving them a new queen, works about 50% of the time. Okay, I think this is one of the last slides I've got before we jump over to Lynn, but a lot of questions on small hive beetles and wax moths. I'm going to play this little video here. Oops. Oh, that was supposed to be a video. Now I don't remember how to play it. But anyway, on the far right here, this really big larva, that's a wax moth larva. This really small one, that's a small hive beetle larva. You shouldn't see larvae in your hive. If I'm seeing either one of these larvae in my hive, I'm concerned because it means that my hive isn't strong enough to get rid of them. 99% of the time, a good, strong, healthy hive can keep these larvae out of the hive, keep small hive beetles and wax moths under control. So usually if I see these larvae making a mess inside of a hive, there's something up with my hive. It's weak. There's an issue with it. So keeping your hive strong is by far the best defense against these pests. Now, seeing a few adult small hive beetles in your hive, the little black beetle running around, I expect to see 2 or 3 of those adult beetles running around in my hive. That's perfectly normal. I shouldn't see the larva. The one exception to this, and I get asked this every year because it happens a couple times every year, is occasionally if you buy a nook, a lot of the nook boxes, whether it's a pro nook or a cardboard nook box, etc., the frames sit on the bottom of that nook box instead of in a hive where they kind of hang on the frame rests. In a nook box, those frames rest directly on the ground, on the floor of that nook box. And sometimes you get some small hive beetle larvae under those frames where the bees can't get up under the underside and get rid of them. Once you transfer them to your hive and the bees can get underneath those frames, they'll clean them out in a heartbeat. So I'm not too worried if I see 3 or 4 larvae on the floor of a nook box when I'm pulling the frames out, especially if the nook looks normal or healthy. It shouldn't be a problem. But if you're seeing these in your established hive, it often means your hive is really, really weak and you need to, figure out why they're so weak, which gets into a whole nother presentation. But these are just some pictures if you're new to beekeeping. On the far left here, this is damage from small hive beetles. They kind of make that honey look really sticky and wet and fermented. The small hive beetle larvae just make a huge mess out of honey. And on the far right, this webbing that you see in a hive, this is from the wax moths and the wax moth damage. Okay, so right on time, I am going to jump over into the Q&A and help Dodie answer some of the questions, because I know you guys have been giving us a ton of awesome questions. And I'm going to turn the presentation over to Lynn, who's going to talk about queen excluders, how to use them, and get into some other topics as well. So Lynn, I made you a co-host, so you should be able to share your screen. So I will let you take it away.
Okay, so am I sharing screen and can you hear me?
We can hear you, Lynn. I can't see your screen just yet.
Okay, that's not good. Let me try again.
No problem. There we go. Now we can see
Hey,
it.
all right, super. Thank you. So thank you for having me.
And Lynn, I'm sorry to interrupt. We can't see you, which is fine if that's how you prefer it. But.
Well, I noticed earlier when I had my camera on that it was really, really grainy, and I was afraid that I might have the same result with my video. So I left the camera off if that's okay.
You bet. Just want to make sure.
Right, because sometimes that takes up a lot of the
yes,
bandwidth.
Yes.
Right. So is this at the top two where the Zoom controls? Okay.
What's it?
Well,
Yeah.
go on.
Yep.
All right, so thank you for having me. I do a monthly little article in the magazine, the online magazine called Topics Beekeepers Can't Agree On. And this past month, my topic was queen excluders. And Sherry asked me to come and speak to this month on the webinar about that, to just kind of, I guess, continue the discussion a little bit. So the question that I asked on Facebook was, do you use a queen excluder below your honey super? And I had 20 responses from beekeepers. And of them, 10 said that they use a queen excluder below the honey super to keep brood out of supers. And 10 said that they do not use a queen excluder because they are honey excluders, or because it's just their preference to let the queen lay wherever she wants. But of the 10, 6 of them said that they use queen excluders for other purposes. And it's probably even higher than that. So I wanted to first talk about things that you can use a queen excluder for, besides simply keeping the queen out of the honey super. So it is a very versatile tool. You can use it as a queen includer. So for instance, when you first get your package, or maybe you catch a swarm, you can use the queen excluder to keep the queen locked in your box. You put the queen excluder between the bottom board and the brood box, and then you remove it once you start to see eggs or cap brood. You can't leave it on indefinitely, because the queen excluder will also trap drones. And to be honest, some queens are small enough to sometimes get through it, but most of them can't. You can also use it to isolate the queen to a specific box, so she's just easier to find later when you need to find her. You can use a queen excluder to trap or filter drone. One of the queen breeders who chimed in said that he uses it to keep spicy or unproven genetics out of the gene pool. So if you have a spicy hive and you're planning to requeen, you might think about using a queen excluder just to keep those drones from adding to the gene pool of spicy drone genes. The overnight split method uses a queen excluder to move nurse bees into the box to be split while keeping the queen in the bottom. So what happens is you make sure you shake all your bees down into the bottom box, and especially the queen. Then you put your queen excluder on, and you've pulled up a couple of frames of brood that's uncapped. And then you put that all back together, go inside. The next morning when you come out, the nurse bees will have come up to the top box where the frames of open brood are. So that's part of the overnight split process. And in a similar way, the Demery swarm control method also uses the queen excluder to bring the nurse bees up, which makes more room in the queen, where the queen is. And that gives the impression that there's a swarm that's already taken place. So that's also a method that's used with the queen excluder. So this is an interesting looking contraption. It's called a queen confinement cage. And I don't know that I would ever have any use for them, but they are something that queen breeders use. And here's kind of an example of how it's used. This is called a breeder hive. And you can see on the left that it's sectioning off 3 frames. And on the right, you can see it from the bottom. And the way they make this, they cut that groove in the woodware first, and then the queen excluder is bent into that opening right there. So that's a pretty cool little contraption. Here's another one that's just a single frame one. You can't really buy these. So if you have soldering skills, maybe you can make your own. This is one that's made out of a plastic queen excluder. So I don't know, I'm pretty handy with plastic stuff. I might be able to make one out of plastic. You can also use them to find the queen. So this is an example of how you can use one by, first you take an empty box for the bottom. You're going to get, if you can find it, a couple of frames of drawn comb. If you have some with some open brood, even better, put that in the bottom box. Then you put your queen excluder on. Then you put on an empty box on the top. Then as you're looking for your queen on the frames, if you don't see her, then you can shake off all the bees into this box and you smoke them down. And when you are done, the queen and drones will be stuck in the top box. The alternative is going the opposite way, where you actually shake all the bees off in front of the hive. You put your queen excluder on the bottom board, reassemble the box, and then let the bees go back into the box. So after a bit of time, you come back and check. Sometimes you'll find a small cluster of bees in front of the hive. And if you look, you might find the queen there. Or if you don't find her there, then you can look, you have to take the boxes off again, but you might find the queen underneath the queen excluder. Now, the advantage of this is that with the previous method, it is actually kind of hard sometimes to smoke the bees down because bees just want to go up. They just want to come up. They don't want to go down. And with this method, they want to get back in their box. So this one is a little less difficult to get them back in. It's easier to get them back in the box. Blake has a really good video on this on his website. So I'm showing you here how to go to that video. If you go to Bee Help and Questions, and then go to Queens, and then requeening. And there's probably other ways to do this, easier, faster, probably. How to find your queen when you can't find her. So you'll click there and that'll come up. And there's actually 2 videos, a part 1 and a part 2. So he'll show you how to do that. And then there's also just the written instructions on how to do that. A lot of good stuff on the website. So the real question though, is are queen excluders honey excluders? So when I was doing my information on Facebook and people were chiming in, you know, everyone always says, well, some people say, yes, it is. Other people say, no, it's not. Well, E.T. Ash made a comment that really piqued my interest. And he said, for a long time, I thought, with no evidence or experience in regards to queen excluders, that a queen excluder might in fact be a honey excluder. Then I read Jerry Hayes' article in the American Bee Journal titled, "Is a queen excluder a honey excluder?" After reading the article, I tried his setup on 1 yard of bees, and after that began using excluders on most yards in most years. So when I read that, I mean, what I thought was, well, queen excluders must not be honey excluders. But since I was writing this article, I thought, well, I should at least pursue trying to find this article that E.T. referred to. So I did find it, and it's called, the actual article is called Queen Excluder or Honey Excluder, and it was published in 1985. And it summarized GW or Jerry Hayes Jr.'s experiment comparing 3 hive configurations to determine if a queen excluder affects honey yields. So he set up his experiment with, as I said, 3 different hive configurations. I'm going to show you what those are. So first he had the control, which was your typical kind of layout, a standard bottom board, 2 deeps, and then supers on top, but with no queen excluder at all. So that's just a bigger version. Then in the second one, he used probably what most people do if they use a queen excluder, a standard bottom, a couple of deeps, a queen excluder, and then the honey supers. But for his third one, something really different. He used a standard bottom, which was completely blocked off. 2 supers, two brood boxes, one of which has a drone escape, then his queen excluder. Then he used an upper opening, an upper entrance, and then his honey supers. So that's really different. And for his experiment, he used 16 colonies. They were on pallets, 4 hives per pallet. And they were divided up like this. So he had 6 that were control with no queen excluder, and then 5 each of the other setups. So 5 that had queen excluders with the bottom entrance only, and 5 that had queen excluders with an upper entrance only. And all colonies were equalized and then left to settle for 3 weeks. So in addition to wanting to know whether it affected honey yield, he also wanted to know if the placement of the entrances and queen excluders had any effect on the brood rearing. And so brood was measured at the beginning, middle, and end of the season. So when they first started out, the brood measurements were, as you see here, so the no queen excluder, the bottom entrance, and the upper entrance. And those were all pretty close to the same amount of brood. 2 months later, well, they were drastically different. The no queen excluder and the upper entrance only had a lot more brood than the bottom entrance only. And by the end, it was still the same thing. The bottom entrance only did not have as much brood. And what he found was the ones that had the bottom entrance only, the queens preferred to come in and put the nectar straight into the bottom boxes, which was the brood chamber. And rather than go through the queen excluder and put it up in the honey super. And so as a result, the brood chamber became honey bound, which meant the queen had less room to lay, which meant that there were less new workers, which in the other configurations did not become honey bound. So in the setup where they had an upper entrance only, it was actually the exact opposite. Because the bees were coming in all full of nectar and going straight into the honey super, that's where they would deposit the nectar. They didn't really want to go down to through the queen excluder down to the brood box. And what he found was that there was enough honey in the brood box for the needs, but there wasn't extra. They were putting down as much as what was needed for raising brood, but they weren't storing it down there. So as a result, the brood box had plenty of room for the queen to lay. There was never an issue with backfilling. And while I was interested in the aspect of more honey, this is the part that was really, really interesting to me, because last year I had such a problem with backfilling that this was just like, oh my gosh, this is what I wanted to hear. Any way to make less backfilling is of great interest to me. So there were problems during the experiment. It was not without problems that definitely affected the results. There was skunk predation. And let me tell you what he said, how skunks work. Skunks will come up to the entrance of the hive and they will scratch and claw at the entrance. And as the bees come out, the skunks eat them. They don't worry about getting stung. They just eat the bees as they come out of the hive. So this was a problem. And so of the colonies that had no queen excluder at all, they had been preyed upon, but were not too much affected, probably because they had a lot of brood to start with. So they could afford to, they had brood to spare, I guess you could say. They had bees to spare. But the bottom entrance only colonies, one of them had been killed outright and 2 were very weak. And of the colonies that had the upper entrance only, they weren't not affected at all because the skunks couldn't scratch at the entrance at the bottom because there was no bottom entrance. So they were not able to do their little routine and eat bees from the upper entrance only colonies. So as far as the results on the honey, the first column that you see here is the control hive that had no queen excluder at all. And you can see that there was the one that had the skunk predation that had no honey stored, but all the rest of them, you know, between 70 and 44 pounds. The colonies that had a bottom entrance only, well, you can see they were seriously affected. There was only one that was not preyed on, and that one only had 30 pounds. One of them had 41 pounds. The other ones had no honey to be stored. So you can definitely say that the results of the bottom entrance only was very much affected by the skunks. And in the third column is the upper entrance only. They were not affected by the skunks. They did have one queen that disappeared, but the rest of them should be pretty accurate as far as what you would expect under normal circumstances. So the no queen excluder and the upper entrance only stored about the same amount of honey, 58.8 and 59.425. And the bottom entrance only stored only 35. That's when you exclude the ones that had 0 honey, 35.5 pounds, which was approximately 23.5 pounds less honey than the other two configurations. So we know for sure that the other two, those results are probably pretty accurate. It would be safe to say that the bottom entrance queen excluder probably would have had higher honey yields if it hadn't been the skunk. But nevertheless, you can still think that the upper entrance only one was still very accurate results. So Hayes concluded that these results are quite dramatic, and it appears from his limited test that queen excluders may well indeed also be honey excluders. And from this data, the use of queen excluders should be highly coordinated with appropriate upper entrance. And this could help maintain the queen in its designated brood area away from honey supers and perhaps maximize the amount of usable extracted honey. So Jerry Hayes, he's been a contributor to the American Bee Journal for almost 40 years, and he writes the column, The Classroom Beekeeping Questions and Answers. And I found where 30 years later in his column on December 15th, December 2015, a reader asked him what he advocates for top entrances. And so Jerry gave an update on his current practice on top and bottom entrances. So here's his column, and you probably can't really see that, but basically what he says he does now, and this was in 2015, he says, well, that way I used to do things was pretty complicated. Now all I do is I just prop the supers up with a stick. So his complicated process before, he just puts a stick in there and props them, gives them an entrance by using a stick. And then he says, well, what do? Do you close off the bottom completely like before? And he says, no, I just leave a small opening a couple of inches wide so that trash and dead bees can be more easily dragged out and let the colony self-select. So there you have it. He did this experiment way back in 1985, I think it was, and 30 years later, this is what he does. But he's still obviously a believer in giving them an upper entrance above a queen excluder. So if you have a honey super on, you should consider using an upper entrance. And if you have a honey super on with a queen excluder, you should definitely consider using an upper entrance. So when it comes to upper entrances, Sherry in the May magazine just covered using a notched inner cover, which can be used as an upper entrance. And you just place the inner cover above the queen excluder and below the honey super. Not all inner covers have notches though, so check yours before you just assume you're going to go and use that as your before you can use that as your entrance. There's a thing called an Amiri shim, and some beekeeping supply stores sell them, or you can make them yourself. If you want the step-by-step plans with photos and a material list, if you Google in the Beekeeper's Workshop, the Amiri shim, it has all that. And you can get entrance discs. They're available in metal and plastic, and also several styles. I know for sure the metal ones are in different sizes. So if you're going to buy them, make sure you're paying attention to the size, because if you think you're getting the big 5-inch ones and you're getting the little 2.5-inch ones show up on your doorstep, you might be surprised. So be sure to check the size. If you have a 3D printer, there are many project files online. You can just print them yourself. So in conclusion, if you use a queen excluder, add an upper entrance for better honey yield. And if you want to also eliminate backfilling in the brood chamber, use only an upper entrance. And that's all I have, Blake.
Wow, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. I am so interested. I had not heard that about adding the upper entrance, and that makes complete sense logically, that would work.
Yeah, you know, it really does. When you think about it, we know that the bees, we have to coax them up there to start with,
right,
at first, you know. And so yeah, we can get the bees to go up there and put the honey up, the nectar up there and make honey, but giving them an upper entrance just sort of like just make it easier for them to start with.
Yeah,
you know,
absolutely. I love that. Yeah. Well, I'm going to definitely change how I teach queen excluders now, because I will definitely be recommending that upper entrance.
And I think you should recreate this experiment next summer, Blake.
Absolutely. I could probably even do it this year. So I'm gonna go try that on some of our hives. And what we'll try to do is take a yard of like 100 hives, and we'll put queen excluders on all of them and do an upper entrance on half and a lower entrance only on half, and see what happens. So
super. I'll look forward to reading what the results are.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Lynn. That is so appreciated. And there's lots of great comments in the chat and Q&A. Thank you as well. So we really appreciate you jumping in and educating us.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So folks, we're just right on time. Lynn did a perfect job of keeping us on schedule. If you have any more questions, feel free to continue putting them in the Q&A box, and Dodie and myself will get those answered for you guys. You'll be getting an email from us with a link to this recording and instructions on how to get to the videos we talked about. And don't forget that we also publish all the questions from the Q&A in our monthly magazine. So check out our Texas Bee Supply Monthly, and you can find a link in there that shows you how to get to all the question and answers from these webinars. So with that, guys, we will see you in June, and June's going to be all about wrapping up the honey flow, getting ready to harvest honey, and getting ready to prepare our bees for the long southern summer months. So with that, I'll see you in the Q&A box, and if not there, I'll see you all in June. Have a great spring, everybody.